Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts. It is so good to be back. As you know, we took a couple weeks off to celebrate the winter holidays. And so this is our first episode of 2025. And I'm excited for this one. As many of you know, we've been doing these we call them story episodes, but it's a chance where we are connecting with individuals from a variety of different churches and denomination backgrounds, as well as authors, and just getting a feel for what their stories are, what the unique pieces are for them coming out of the specific denomination or religion that they did, as well as some of the most important parts for healing and giving their resources and suggestions. And that is what we are going to do today. So I'll introduce the guest in just a moment here, but wanted to let you know that we'll be back next week with one of our regular episodes, and we'll just keep going from there. I'm really excited about the new year, being able to explore things like money and financial and health trauma as a result of high control religion. We have so many amazing guests lined up, and Andrew and I will talk about that more next week. But then, of course, in between all of those episodes, we will be doing these story episodes. So I got a chance today to talk to my friend and colleague who's actually been on Sunday School Dropouts a couple times before. So you can go back to season 1 and check out our episodes with Jessica Hyne. But I wanted to just introduce you to Jessica really quickly. Jessica is joining us today to share her story of growing up in the Church of Christ denomination. So we talk about everything from the structure of the Church of Christ to striving for certainty, rigid thinking, and being a part of the frozen chosen. And if you don't get what that is, you'll just have to listen. Jessica is also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Tennessee and a practitioner at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. Her work with clients in her practice and at CTRR focuses on individuals coming out of high control religions, rigid thinking, and fundamentalism, and learning how to find their inherent goodness and to live in a more connected way to the world. So without further ado, let's bring in Jessica Hyne. Welcome, Jessica, back to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It's exciting to have you here today because we're going to be talking about maybe a little bit more of your personal story, which is something we haven't dove into yet. So I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yes, I'm so happy to be here and excited to kind of dig in and share a bit about my history.
Yes. So, I don't know if we've had anybody on the podcast, just generally speaking, who has a Church of Christ background, but that is yours. And so when we were thinking through the different denominations and this denomination came up as like, oh, I have the perfect person for that. Just because not only have you been through it, but you know how to articulate your experiences so well. So to start off, if you want to just maybe tell us a little bit about your background within the Church of Christ, what it was like, kind of growing up in it, and we'll get into like the, question asking process and whatnot, but just kind of generally, what was that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically both sides of my family, 2 generations, actually one is 3 generations, the other is 2 generations back, are Church of Christ heritage. And so I have a long history within this denomination generationally. And it sort of started in the 1900s as an offshoot in the revival in Kentucky. And so it's very prevalent in the South. So there's a lot of infusion of Southern culture within the denomination because of that. And it was really fascinating for me because I grew up, of course, being 3rd generation, 2nd generation on my mom's side. And essentially my parents really wanted to create an environment where that was the only people we interacted with. So my educational experience was entirely within the Church of Christ denomination and Church of Christ education system. And in addition to, of course, like going to church every Sunday morning and Sunday night, and then Wednesday night. And it was definitely, really young. I started like really intaking a lot of what was being communicated. And, what's sort of ironic within the Church of Christ, there's no, unification of the Church of Christ. Everybody is their individual church, right? So there's no hierarchy whatsoever. Your little church kind of is its own subculture. And so the one I happen to have been born into was actually like the liberal side of that denomination.
Interesting.
Fantastically liberal, actually, considering the breadth of the denomination, because there are certain churches that are way more fundamentalist and some that are a lot less fundamentalist. And I didn't really know that growing up, except for I would get kind of, if I was interacting with other people and they heard where I went to church, some of them would be a little suspicious, a little like, I'm not sure about that. What's going on there? So I could kind of get the lay of the land. But a lot of the doctrines are really intriguing because they really mirror a lot of frozenness. The kind of joke is Baptists will say to the Church of Christ, you're the frozen chosen, really.
That's so funny.
For Baptist, the Church of Christ is even more frozen. And that's true when you sit in the pews. It's so fascinating. When you sit in the pews, you're not allowed to move at all. There's absolutely no clapping. There's no, you can't call back and response, those kinds of things forbidden. Everything is very rote, super rote. It's 3 songs and a prayer. Everything is completely, no creativity whatsoever. Like everything has to be completely uniform. And the denomination sort of on the more liberal side, some of them would do things like we had a projector instead of out of the songbook, and that was huge. Like that was a huge, big deal. I remember the dialogue within my personal church, and people left because we used a projector instead of using the songbooks, because that's the kind of rigidity that was required to be a part. And if you stepped out of that, people got very nervous. But it was really interesting growing up in it because I was interacting in my educational experience with people at other churches of Christ. And so I really was very curious, oh, they think they're right. So I better go to their church because I think there might be something wrong with my church. Because I'm getting these side eyes, these sort of like strange remarks at times. Bible teachers would say things and say, well, that's not safe. What they're doing, that's not safe, like using the projector. So it was really fascinating for me to kind of grow up in this environment because it very much mirrored my own trauma of the frozenness I was feeling inside. And I really do believe that it's because of the shame. And it's really, really strong, especially for the women. You're not allowed to pray in front of a man because that at any age. So like your child, you as the mother cannot pray in front of him because he is ahead of you. So there's a lot of like really rigid expectations, particularly for women, which is true, obviously among much of fundamentalism. But I remember being about 12. And my way of kind of handling this, because I was trying to figure out, who's doing it right? Like which one of these churches in the Church of Christ is doing it right? Because that was what I was bred to think, there's one right way and I've got to find it. And so at a very young age, I asked my parents, I was like, can I just go to like all the church camps? Can I just like go to all of them? Like all the Church of Christ church camps? And they thought this was a great idea, I'm sure, to get rid of me. And so I would hop all summer long to all the church camps from all the churches of Christ. So I got the doctrine of the breadth of sort of Church of Christ doctrine. And that was a real shocker for me. Because I would hear things that even my own parents would dispute, but I didn't know that at the time. I just thought, well, apparently if this is the safest way, I better do it the safest way, which is obviously the most fundamentalist.
Shocking. Yeah.
I would think that. And so, it was definitely a really interesting way to grow up, but at the same time, I really, really had a lot of curiosity as a kid. That was almost like something that was my thing. I was deeply, deeply curious. I loved reading. I thought this was so fun. And since I knew from a very young age, right, like the center of your life should be Christianity, I was very curious about the history of the denomination I was born into, why they had it right, doctrine, all the theological things. And I'm really grateful that that was preserved, even though I was feeling a lot of shame. That component was still there and was very much a guiding light, I think, to finding, there's other ways to think about this. We're like this big in the branch of all of Christianity. Within the Church of Christ history, they very much believe they are the only ones going to heaven. And certain churches believe their church is the only one going to heaven. Like the rest of the denomination doesn't necessarily mean you're going to heaven. And so it's a really unique structure, as well as the pastors do not have to be formally educated of any kind. They just have to have a calling. And so that's really unique. Even Baptists are not that way. That does require some theological training. And so it creates a really unusual structure because there's no uniformity within the churches. And the main components are very much, you don't use instruments because that God says to sing and make music in your heart. So you are not to use instruments. And so everything is a cappella, which sort of sets it apart when you experience it. But it is really interesting to look at the pews and just feel the frozenness. You can just, when you sit in the pews, you'll see feet going like this,
Yeah.
You can
Absolutely.
feel here, this is what we do. Mm-hmm. We don't move. We barely sing, but a little bit because it's a cappella and everybody can hear, but like lots of rigidity.
Yeah, that is so interesting because, I grew up in the North. And so when I moved here to the South was the first time that I became aware of Church of Christ. Like, I think I had loosely heard of it as a denomination, but it was not in the North. And so there was never like a lived experience that I had with it. But I do remember the very first client I started working with who had a Church of Christ background. And one of the big areas of like fear and shame for her was that she went to one of the more quote unquote liberal churches within kind of that spectrum. And I want to say they had some special service that was more like liturgical or something like that for her, she loved. And that was like really spoke to her heart. But it was an area of like fear and almost hiding from family and other people because of like wondering that perception of like, what are they going to think? But I thought it was so interesting what you said, how it is like really connected to Southern culture. So I'm wondering if you would expand on that, especially for those of us who didn't grow up in the South. I think I understand it now, having lived here for, a decade and a half, but how would you explain that to somebody who hasn't grown up in the South and goes like, what does that mean to have Southern culture woven into your denomination?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think some of the best components to me are we stay very surface. You show no vulnerability, no signs of any emotion other than pleasantry and kindness. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's almost a fakeness in the way you interact with people. You're smiling. You might be dying on the inside for whatever reason, but you go to church and like everything is wonderful. And we sit in the same pew. So like it's very routine in the Church of Christ that you sit exactly in the same spot. You never move. You sit all together. And that is your spot as a generation. It gets passed down.
Wow.
And, I give a lot of credit to my parents, truly, because they grew up in the very conservative end of the Church of Christ. And they had their own version of a deconstruction and the idea that maybe there's a grace for people because they grew up in the fire and brimstone sort of side of it that was really extreme. And so from their perspective, they were very great, grace-filled, and more vulnerable than what they grew up with. But a lot of the Southern culture kinds of things often there's a lot of things to tradition, right? Within the Southern culture, tradition reigns supreme. And so we don't change things because that would mean we don't show honor to our heritage. And so that's very prevalent within the Church of Christ. Like we always do it this way. This is how it's always done. We never change it. And you cannot advocate for change. Change is seen as danger in Southern culture as well as within this denomination. I guess the other things that obviously mirror, obviously there's a whole lot of patriarchy within Southern culture. It's always been that way, racism as well. So prevalent within this denomination. Those are huge components of what it is undergirded by, even though it may not be overt. So, for instance, Churches of Christ, I only know of one Black Church of Christ, and we were kind of a sister church to that church, but we had separate churches, right? We were not ever together at all. And it was a bridge, actually, this was in the 1980s, that we had a sister church that was Black, that we would even accept that as a white community, as they are Christians too. So that's how split it is, which obviously mirrors very much of Southern culture. But those are the things that come to mind in the similarity.
Yeah. That baked inness, as somebody who came into that, like the baked inness of religiosity in the South, it's hard to describe unless you're here. Like, unless you have immersed yourself in this culture and have friends who have been here. Like, I remember some of my first Southern friends who had grown up in the South, whether it was, in Tennessee or somewhere else. And I remember just like hearing certain things that they were taught as kids, like in school. And I was like, wait, what? Like, it is so different. I remember one of my friends who's a very smart person, like talking about what the Civil War was about. And of course, the South's version of what the Civil War is very different than the rest of the country and the world. But there really is a belief that this is what it's about. And that's why we see like Confederate flags. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation. I really resonated with what you said in terms of the rigidity piece. I grew up in a denomination that not many people have heard about because it's only in the North. And it's a derivative of the Dutch Reformed Church and everything. And so whenever I'm in the South and I'm explaining like, what was that? I always say, the rigidity of Church of Christ is part of it. And so when you're talking about like the projector, and like we had projectors, but they were large conversations, right? Or things like that. And if you swayed from that version of what the church said, because we also didn't have like a denomination rules or, like you guys did, very similar to what you guys had. So it was church by church, but it really reminds me of that rigidity. And I wonder, like for you, having parents who went through their deconstruction process, so now they're in the quote unquote liberal side, and you're trying to find the best way, which is going to push you more towards the conservative side. How did that look in your family? Like, was that an area of like judgment from you to your parents? Was that an area of them trying to be like, whoa, Jessica, like, let's, pause for a second? Or how did that look?
The way that it actually looked for me was very unique. And I think it was part of my history and who I am personally, as well as kind of the family dynamics that I grew up in. But for me, it was very much personal. Because vulnerability was not something, and anger was completely unacceptable for me to have, my choice to go to a more conservative side, I very much did on my own, right? Like, this was such an internal process. Hiding was a huge component of what I found safety in, because that was what I learned you don't talk about these things. Like, if you're different, you better hide it, because that's not safe to be, even if that meant being more conservative. And so we just didn't talk about it.
Wow.
And I knew full well I definitely wasn't going to criticize my parents, even if I internally might have decided, like, hey, I'm going to be safe and, go to these more conservative churches because I know that they know the right way and they're sure that they know the right way. So it ended up for me that it created almost such an isolated spiritual experience.
Yeah.
Because there was no communication around it. And to be perfectly honest, I do think my parents, if they could do it over, would have changed that and had more communication, but they didn't really. When they deconstructed, they never talked about it. It was almost like a shame in the family that they went to the liberal Church of Christ, because the rest of their family shunned them. They wouldn't go to church with them. They wouldn't talk about it with them. So my parents had their own shame around what they had sort of become liberal around. And so it created almost like a backing off for them. They didn't want to talk about it because it held so much shame.
Wow. Wow. That is so interesting. I mean, I was going to say we can have more conversations, and we will. But I'm just like the overlap and parallels of our upbringings and just like church structures is so similar, which is probably why we always have so much to talk about, because we just get each other. But I know you to be a curious person. Now you've said, you grew up with a huge sense of curiosity. So I'm assuming that curiosity also is part of what led you to asking questions, that deconstruction process. So I am just curious, like, when did you first start asking some of those questions or realizing, hey, this isn't making sense, this isn't cutting it? What were some of your big questions? All that.
Yeah. It happened really early for me, but it was just little micro moments almost, because so I wanted to stay safe. So I stayed in these more conservative churches, going to their church camps and their youth groups and all of that. But at the same time, I had a part of me that was like so curious, because I knew other people think differently. Like, I did know that, even though I didn't have exposure to these people, I knew enough to know other people think differently. And so when I would hear, for instance, don't read Maya Angelou, that is the devil's work in the world, a little part of me was like, why don't I check that book out?
You rebel.
I was a little bit of a rebel. And the one thing I had a library, and it was the public library, and my parents liked to take me. And so I could, I could look at whatever. They weren't really paying attention closely at all, which, again, privilege there, because I know a lot of people grew up where they would have been paying attention. I wouldn't have had this ability to do that, but I would hide it in my backpack. And that is sort of the beginning process of my curiosity being like, there's other perspectives. Like, there's other ways of viewing this. And, I was really, really drawn by about 12, 13 to contemplative spirituality. I had found a Richard Foster book and a Brother Lawrence book, which are contemplatives. And I remember reading them and being like, okay, this is not being taught anywhere in this experience, but something about this resonates with me. And I didn't tell anybody. This was a totally like solo journey. But there was a part of me that was like, that's something different than what I'm being taught here.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So that was the beginning stages, but it just snowballed essentially. Once I was the first person in my family and my extended family at that time to not go to a Church of Christ university. This was a big deal in my family. My parents were quote unquote liberal for letting me I could choose any Christian school. And this was like huge. In fact, his sisters, my dad's sisters, got angry with him for allowing this and saying, you are leading her down the wrong path. Like, I got letters from family members, very concerned, saying, you should not be learning at this institution. And this was a very conservative school.
I mean, I know which one it is, and I'm like, oh yeah, because like that's where my church fed everybody into, was that church or that school.
Dangerous.
Yes. Yeah.
For them.
Yeah.
But again, it allowed a sort of secondary deconstruction where I started to see the breadth of Christianity as a whole and understand where my denomination fell.
Interesting.
New. But also, when I turned 16, the little rebel that I was, my parents weren't really paying attention. And so on Sunday mornings, I would say, I'm going to this church. And they knew I had gone to other churches, so they were okay with that. But I wasn't really going to that church. I started trying out different denominations. I went to a Presbyterian church. I went to Quaker church. I went to a Pentecostal church because I was very curious. I was like, what is going on here? These are all so different. What the hell is going on here?
Yeah.
So that was part of also the journey, was the experience of trying on different ways of viewing things.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that is so great. And I love that you, I mean, like that your rebelliousness was like trying different churches. It wasn't like, I'm going to go to the club. I'm going to do these things with my
Oh
boyfriend.
God, no,
It's like,
no,
it's like, I'm going to a different church.
I would have never. I would have never. And that reading
Yeah.
Richard Foster was my like rebellion because he's incredibly
Yeah.
conservative.
I think so many of our parents have no idea how good they had it. Like that was the rebelliousness is like, I'm reading this book by a very strict Christian author or very,
Yes.
contemplative. And like,
Yes.
that's the wild, crazy child that you're raising.
The
So,
wild, crazy. But I really felt like it was a rebellion.
of course.
My experience
Yeah.
of it was I'm out of the lines and I kind of
Yeah.
like this.
Oh, I love that so much. Yeah, that is so great. When you think about like some of the more difficult parts about, untangling, deconstructing for you, even, maybe more into your later years, that's getting you closer to the place that you're at now. What were some of the things that were difficult or maybe even unique to, people coming out of Church of Christ that they're deconstructing?
Yeah. For me, the frozenness was probably the hardest part, which is the shame. Even though I was learning these new things, the shame was still deeply embedded. I could be curious intellectually, but the idea of that actually curiosity being felt was altogether unavailable to me. And because hiding was the resource, right? Like you just didn't become vulnerable because that was unacceptable, then I felt very lonely. No one really knew me. I was called Hermie in college because I did not think it was okay to be vulnerable. It was not okay to show up in any sort of authentic way. And it created difficulty, obviously, in relationships because I would witness other people get very close, and I would think, "How are they doing that? How are they?" Because in my experience, you just didn't do that. And I feel like that is again part of the Church of Christ. Like you just show pleasantries. You never let anyone in, and so. That was probably the hardest part. The other part is disassociation is highly present in the Church of Christ because you're not allowed to be vulnerable. You freeze and then you're gone. You're not really there. When you look in people's eyes, you would be amazed at how many people are not really there. And that was true for me too. And so it was difficult to ever know that I wasn't there because it had always been that way. I had always been frozen that way. So I knew nothing different. I just thought something's wrong with me.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting.
And I find having worked with other people in this denomination a really similar experience. And oftentimes it isn't until adulthood that some of this gets broken for different reasons. The frozenness gets broken. But yeah.
Were there any specific doctrines or kind of patterns of believing? I think like what you said about the certainty piece, like we were the ones that had the right answer. Was that something that you needed to untangle or that you saw it showing up in other areas of life as well?
Oh, in every way. I was so black and white. Black and white, I thought, was the way to be. Instead of it being something that you grow out of or something you begin to see the complexity of life, I very much thought, this is the way to be saved. You must be right. And that showed up everywhere. Everything from the way I learned about psychology when I was in college or the way that I interpreted mathematics. It showed up everywhere. The way I handled relationships, I've got to be right. So there was a huge perfectionistic part of me because I had to be right. And so it created a really hard dynamic, obviously, and no one could live up to that standard.
Sure. Yeah. Which begs that shame question that, right? Like, yeah, I mean, it's like I remember I remember thinking, I don't deal with shame. Like, that's not something that's a problem for me. And then I listened to a podcast from my dear friend, our friend Hillary McBride, who is talking about shame. And I was like, oh, no, that is literally all day, every
All
day.
day, every day.
My entire life, I'm wearing this coat of shame. And I'm hearing that, from you too, of like, and this fits with that complex trauma kind of umbrella of like, there's so much that's quote unquote normal. It's just the way that we grew up, that then you get out of that and you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know that there was life outside of that, because this was just the way that I was.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I still deal with it now. I have to really check in with that kind of rigidity, because it feels so normal. It feels so familiar. And to see out of it still at times feels like danger. Like, to think of it that everyone else has a unique perspective and that that's okay. I have to constantly remind myself of that, because it feels so unfamiliar.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's so many thoughts I have about that, like in an agreement and like deepening that conversation. Cause it's just, I've been thinking a lot about how different like theological and biblical and denominational concepts and indoctrination just in general, like for children, like the way that stunts development. And like for those of us who have been doing therapy for years, it's like, there's maybe like a better grasp on like when we're sliding into, like the rigid thinking or whatever, but it's always like, that's still the gut response. Like that's the go-to. And it's like this constant having to be aware of like, oh, I went back to that spot. I've got to, come back into the present, nuance is okay. And I hear that a lot in what you're saying, just with the way that Church of Christ was and how they taught that life was.
Yes. And, I think, to be honest, I think that is the work, which is, it will always be the knee-jerk response. I have just come to appreciate that part of myself, because I know that it kept me so safe in there to really believe that's the way the world was. Mm-hmm. And, I just am so grateful now that there's enough curiosity there and there's enough self-compassion. That's sort of the other component of this that's really, really hard, is that in my experience, the doctrine of the Church of Christ specifically very much does not want you to have a sense of self. And does not want you to ever know it's there, nor hold any sense of goodness inside because we are bad. And that the idea, every time I can find that place within myself that holds compassion for me, it almost feels like a win every single time, because it is the exact opposite of what the teachings were.
Yeah. I love that. I love that you can celebrate that. It's funny. I was thinking about that this morning, like how so much of healing is, it's in the little moments, right? It's in the everyday interactions. And I had a response to somebody who had shared something with me this morning, and I sent the response and I started crying, and I was like, well, that's weird, because it wasn't like sad or anything, but it was just a response of like compassion and empathy, like, which is how I would respond. But I had this moment where I was like, that was never accessible to me back then, where everything was a rush and everything had to be done perfectly, and any little deviation from the plan was going to cause anxiety, because we have to stick so much to this script and the rigid structure. And I was like, oh wow, there's a moment of growth. And I think like self-compassion, like any moment where you're like, oh, I'm kind to myself instead of ripping myself apart, like that is so huge.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
When you think about your own healing journey that you started on, that you are on, what have some of the important things, or the things that have been really meaningful to you as you've healed? Like, what are those for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it has been sort of twofold. The first component was when I could get my disassociation to step aside and I could really connect to it and realize that's what was happening and be able to turn inside, to be able to be internally curious with myself. I could be curious about my external world and learning things and all that was acceptable. But the idea of turning that inside, that I could be curious about the insides of me, and that was okay to do. And not only that, but actually it would give me information that would help me tremendously. That felt like that U-turn of outside to inside curiosity was a huge turning point in my life, because I thought I could get there by learning, by reading. The thing that had gotten me out of danger, I thought I'm going to learn enough about, for instance, emotions or psychology, or I will learn about it, and that somehow will shift my insides. And absolutely it did not.
I get that.
And so for me, that was the first component. The second component was, where are the spaces where not only can I turn inside, but I can let that inside of me show outside of me and connect to people. I did not know authenticity and connection. I did not know it when they were in competition. Hiding was my best resource. So the idea I would connect, and I could do that on the surface level. I'd gotten really good at that because that was the only thing acceptable. But as far as connecting authentically and vulnerably, I was a novice at that, even at like 27. I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't know who to do that with and who would be able to tolerate what I might share about my insides, and finding places where that was available. And not only that, but it was embraced and it was understood and it was validated. Changed my entire life. And I think that's the story of a lot of people.
So beautiful. I love that. I mean, and I think, just as a friend, like, I think about all our conversations that we have, and it's like, there's not a lot of surface, like, ever, but there is so much safety in the depths, which is why it's like, I mean, we can talk about like Love is Blind and whatever, and we do, right? But then there's also just like, it's like, oh, I can also just show up and be like, here's where I'm struggling. I need some support or whatever. And either one of us can be like, cool, yep, I'm here. What do you need? Or I'll just sit with you. And I think that I love that is something that's meaningful to you and you demonstrate that to others. And I agree. The relational piece there's nothing else that rivals it in terms of like the healing process. It's so essential.
It is. And, I also think for me, I bypassed so much of my work because I didn't navigate that aspect. I started to know my insides, and that felt safe enough. I knew it. But that idea of finding the groups of people where I could share that with other people was, I mean, honestly, like 2 weeks ago in an IFS training, I was working on the part of me all the way back from, I was about 4 years old, that knew groups aren't safe. Like they ain't safe here to show up. And, I think it's an evolutionary process to begin to feel the groups that are safe. And then you can find the brave spaces where actually it isn't always safe. And I've got to be brave sometimes and show up anyway. And that was part of my story too, which is I sort of cultivated the safe spaces for a really long time as an incubator of like, I'm only going to show up authentically in these really safe spaces. And then going broader and going into these really brave spaces, and deeper relationships where there might be a lot of differences, but that doesn't mean we can't navigate them.
I think that is just a beautiful way of like, we do somatic experiencing, that idea of titration. And like you were naturally doing that of saying, here's like the edges of my safety. And then I'm going to do like a little bit more and a little bit more. And I think that's so beautiful and it's such a soothing way for our nervous systems to heal, because we're not, overwhelming them. And I love that there just was that intuitive piece of like, I'll do this much and then I'm okay. And then a little bit more. And that's so important. Yeah. So if you could speak to a person who is like one day out of Church of Christ, what is one piece of advice or support that you would want to give them?
I think my first thought would just be, where are the places and the ways that you can be curious with yourself? How has this experience affected you? What parts of you show up to you? Can you hear them inside? I feel like so many times in my experience in the Church of Christ, people were not curious with one another. They might externally be curious, like internally they might be noticing things, but they would never be curious externally and be curious with another person, because there was so much shame to navigate. You get defensiveness and all kinds of things. And so to me, that idea of finding what practices allow that for you, I feel like everyone is so unique. Therapy obviously can be one, coaching can be another. I mean, there's so many avenues, but also, like people have many ways of being curious, with meditation or whether it's journaling. There's a million ways to be able to turn on the inside, to be able to hear yourself. And I feel like that's the first piece of advice I give anyone, as well as clients, when they first begin this process. Because that aspect of being able to tolerate what you find in there.
Yes, huge.
Is huge. And of course, like you were saying, titration, even if it's just a moment that you can tolerate, of being able to access just one aspect of yourself, one part of yourself. That's kind of what I would say, because I feel like it's almost wrong to ask somebody who left that system in particular not to do that work first before finding your community, because you don't know how to show up in that community even if you found it. So that's probably what I would say.
Yeah. I think that's so helpful. Okay. So as we kind of wrap things up, I'm curious to know what your go-to resources are, whether that was for your own, like, here's what was really helpful for me, or maybe it's something that you recommend to clients, or both.
Yeah. I know for me, it was very important for me to get out of my head. It was very, very important. And I know that's not true for everyone. I just happen to not be a very sporty person. And I think if I would have been, I might have had more contact with my body. But I really encourage people to cultivate whatever practices, because they help me so much, that allow you to be in your body. And that body focus, because so much was thought of in your thoughts, that body attention, for me, the things that were effective were somatic work, was IFS work, was body work, and doing touch work around trauma. Those are just my technologies. Meditation was a huge component of that. But I think everyone, I feel like there's a million ways you can make contact with your body in sports and movement. There's so many ways you can be with yourself in your own body. And so to me, those are the things that I really encourage people to experience, try on, and then find the one that works for you and ditch the others. Because we're not all the same. And that's okay.
The beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And very different than like religion, especially the rigid religions where it's like, here's the one way to do it. And it's like, just kidding. There's so many ways. Yeah. I love that. Well, I want to just, so that people know, I mean, they've heard us talk about like kind of this professional side. If you want to share a little bit about what you do professionally, I don't know if you're taking clients or not, but if people want to get in touch with you, are you on social media? I mean, I know the answer, but share all that stuff.
Yes, I'm not on social media. I don't have any marketing beyond CTRR. And it's just a personal choice that I made. But that I love working one-on-one with people. It feels like even from the youngest of ages, I knew I wanted to be a healer when I was 13. I just knew. I just knew inside. And so for me, the thing that I really love is being able to sit with somebody and be the support that they need so they can turn inside. And for me, the ways that I do that professionally is blending somatic experiencing, which I'm trained in, and IFS, which I'm also trained in. And the blending of those components are really beautiful for me because I feel like IFS in parts work really allows you to hear your self-talk. You can really hear, what am I saying to myself? What shows up repeatedly? What shows up in these moments where I feel a really intense sensation? But also this component of body work. And the idea of being able to turn inside and have ways of interpreting the data that's coming in from my body and be able to work with it and care for it and attend to it. And so I just absolutely love my job. Thank you so much, Laura, for letting me do that. I love it. And I feel like it's a privilege to be able to hear people and hold space for people when they haven't always had that. They haven't had people who could hold capacity for whatever showed up. And for me, a huge component, a huge shift for me, even professionally, was shifting from talk therapy. I don't do that. I do that when people cannot access experiential work. And I will help them navigate that until they can drop inside and you can do more experiential things. And I love experiential work. I love moving around. I love being with whatever emerges in the room together. And it feels almost like improving. And I love improv. Is my favorite thing. And so it feels like my way of incorporating playfulness into my work. And so I am taking clients, and I would love if anybody feels like they resonate with what I'm saying or feel like I might be a person that they're interested in contacting, definitely reach out. I always do a phone call because I want to see, is this fit actually right? You know, like, am I the right kind of person to be doing this work with you? I don't just take clients on. And that's part of the reason that I don't market, is because I want it to be that you're drawn to, I think this is the right direction for me. And I feel like a phone call helps us determine that. So.
Absolutely. Well, I can attest to, if anybody's wondering about Jessica's work, she is incredible. And so if you're looking for somebody to work with, I highly, highly recommend Jessica. Whether you're coming from Church of Christ or not, like, you've got a lot of, understanding of a variety of high control religions. And you just do great work with all of them. So, so I want to thank you for joining us today. There's so many more questions that I'm like, let's talk about this with Church of Christ. So maybe we'll have to have you on again, or we'll, go to our quote unquote satellite office, Mexican restaurant, and we'll just chat privately. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Thank you again to Jessica for joining us for another wonderful episode of Sunday School Dropouts. As you caught in the episode, in the interview, Jessica and I are friends and colleagues, and she is somebody that I've really enjoyed getting to know, and somebody who, really kind of, to use a Christianese term, walks the talk. I think that's how they say it. Anyways, if you listen, to the way that Jessica talks and the way that she emphasizes the importance of connection to self and connection to others, I can attest that that is who Jessica is professionally as well as personally. And I personally find those stories to be extremely inspirational, and really filled with a lot of hope, because I think it shows such a difference, like the gap of difference in between where she came from and who she is now, and where she's continuing to grow. So, like Jessica said, if you want to get in touch with her and work with her, she is accepting clients at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. We will leave all of that information in the show notes so you can get in touch with Jessica, schedule your free inquiry call, and start working working with her. And if what Jessica is saying is interesting to you, but maybe you want to look at other practitioners as well, we've got those for you as well. Again, you can go to the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, click the button that says start working with a coach today. You will see all of the practitioners that are available and ready to take clients, and you can schedule a free inquiry call with all of them. So with that, I think we have wrapped up another episode of Sunday School Dropouts, and all God's people said, Amen.